I hope your doubt is clear. And now, you all please stay tuned for first question. Okay, Prasakti. Okay. I got it. Pre-conscious. So now you all please stay tuned for Roopan ma'am's session, which is going to be on research and statistics. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Keep learning, and I wish you all the best for all your future endeavors. Thank you so much. All please stay tuned for Roopan ma'am all your future endeavors. Thank you so much. All please stay tuned for
Good evening and welcome to your second session of the day, which will be on research and statistics. As you all are aware of, this is a series of 4 demo sessions. I'm sure all of you would have already attended the wonderful session by Ms. Vitasta Dhawan on human development, and now you will be attending the demo session by me, Roopan George, on research and statistics. Also, please note that you have 2 demo sessions on March 21st. The first will be at 7 p.m. by Ms. Kalevani Dureraju on nutrition and dietetics, and the second will be at 7:45 p.m. March 21st, by Ms. Prachi Varshini on textiles. Now, in this demo session on research and statistics, we will be looking at fundamentals of hypothesis testing. The agenda for the session is we will look at what is a research hypothesis, we will learn what is a null and alternative hypothesis, and we will also learn about errors in hypothesis testing. Now let's begin. Before we get to hypothesis testing, we need to know what is a research hypothesis. Now what you see here on the screen is a lot of words. It is the actual definition of a research hypothesis, but it looks a little complicated. So we have simplified it for you in one sentence. A hypothesis is a specific statement about a population that can be tested. So it is a statement, a hypothesis is a statement, but it is not just any type of statement. It is a statement which is specific and can be tested. What do we mean by specific? The word specific means to be clearly defined. For example, if I say it is hot today, that is a very vague statement and it is not specific because the word hot differs from person to person. What is hot for me may not be hot for you. So that is not specific. However, if I say that the temperature at Pune today, March 19, 2022, is 42 degrees Celsius, that is a specific statement and it gives clarity about what you are trying to say. Now, the second requirement for a statement to be a hypothesis is that you should be able to test it. For example, if I say that children in a particular school ABC are very smart, that is also not a specific statement and it cannot be tested. What do I mean by the word smart? The word smart is very vague and subjective again. On the other hand, if I say that the average IQ level of students from school ABC is higher than the national average, that is a specific statement and it can be tested using standardized IQ tools. So, this is the basic definition of a hypothesis. It is a statement that is specific and can be tested. Now, we will look at two more examples. We all have seen the statement that smoking causes lung cancer. But this is a statement. If you want to test this as a hypothesis, if you want to do research on this, then you will write the hypothesis that incidence of lung cancer is higher in individuals who smoke daily than in individuals who do not smoke at all. So it's the same statement, but the statement in which we saw, which is above, is not specific and it cannot be tested. We cannot do research on that. If you want to do research on that, you have to be very specific and you have to state it as a hypothesis. Another example, suppose you want to study whether it is important to eat breakfast before exams or no. The hypothesis will be that exam scores are higher for school students who eat breakfast before the exam than for those who do not eat breakfast before the exam. This is again a hypothesis that is specific and can be tested. So I hope it is clear about what a research hypothesis is. Now we will move on. Where do we come across this word research hypothesis in the broad framework of research? When we are doing research, there are specific steps we should follow, or there's a specific pattern that has to be done. That is why research is research, it has to be systematic. So, the first step in any research is that you start thinking of a problem. What problem do you see in your field of study? If you are a nutrition student, is it malnutrition? Is it anemia? If you are a human development student, is it addiction? Is it psychological distress? What is the problem? Once you have narrowed down to a problem, then you will define a specific research question that you will answer with your research. After defining that question, the third step will be to write a research hypothesis. And here is where you specify what you will be testing. And after writing the research hypothesis, you will state the goals and the objectives of the research. So we saw that we need to write a research hypothesis when doing any research. So we have a problem. When we do a research, we have a problem that we want to study. And we will state two hypotheses from that problem. The first hypothesis will state the accepted fact or what is already known regarding a particular problem. That statement is called the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis states the accepted fact regarding the problem. For example, in the example we saw earlier about breakfast being important to eat before an exam, the null hypothesis will be that there is no association between eating breakfast before an exam and the exam score. Now you might be thinking, wait, maybe there is an association. Yes, maybe there is an association, but it has not been scientifically proved. That is why you are doing the research. But as of now, there is no scientific evidence for this in your particular population or in your particular place. And so, as long as there is nothing that has been done, the null hypothesis will always assume that there is no association or there is no difference, there is no change, no effect. So, the null hypothesis in this example is that there is no association between these two variables. We have stated the null hypothesis, what is already known about the particular problem. Now we have to state another hypothesis called the alternative hypothesis. Now the alternative hypothesis is the opposite of the null hypothesis and it states a change from the accepted fact, or it is what you as a researcher believe might be the outcome of the study. The alternative hypothesis states a change in the accepted fact. So, in the example we saw, the accepted fact is that there is no association between eating breakfast and the exam score. Whereas the alternative hypothesis will be that there is an association between eating breakfast before an exam and the exam score. So, when we do any research, we have a research problem, we state the research question, and then we state what is already known about the problem in the form of a null hypothesis, and then we state a change in that situation, or we state the opposite of the null hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis. We will look at these two hypotheses in a little more detail. Now, the null hypothesis is the hero of our study, or it is the main attraction of our study. The null hypothesis is the type of hypothesis that is believed to be true until and unless it is proven wrong based on experimental data. So we saw that the null hypothesis is the accepted fact or what is already known about a problem. And that accepted fact will remain true until and unless your research has enough evidence, enough strong evidence to prove that it is false. So this is the thumb rule. Please remember that the null hypothesis is always believed to be true unless it is proved that it is false. Certain examples of null hypothesis we will see now. If you want to study whether cats prefer food based on the shape of the food, then the null hypothesis will be that cats show no preference for food based on shape. If you want to study whether plant growth is affected by light color, then the accepted fact or the null hypothesis will be that plant growth is not affected by light color. If you want to study whether age has any effect on musical ability, the null hypothesis or the accepted fact will be that age has no effect on musical ability. So you might notice that in most cases, not all, but in most cases, the null hypothesis will be that there is nothing, there is no association, there is no difference, no change, or no effect. But like I said, this is the case for, in most cases, you will see this word no. But this is not always the situation. For example, let's take an imaginary situation in which I want to study if I want to prove that the sky is not blue. In that case, the null hypothesis will be that the sky is blue because that is an accepted fact. and the alternative hypothesis will be the sky is not blue. So the null hypothesis does not always have to have the word no in it, but in most cases that is a fact. Okay, so we have done a research to study whether light color affects plant growth. And so our null hypothesis will be that light color has no effect on plant growth. Let's assume we have done the research and our evidence shows that the null hypothesis is true and that light color has no effect on plant growth. In that case, we will retain the null hypothesis or we will keep it as it is and we will not do anything else. So the evidence shows that the null hypothesis is true, so the null hypothesis is true. But if the evidence from our research shows that the null hypothesis is wrong, in that case, we will reject the null hypothesis or we will say that the null hypothesis is false and we will accept the alternative hypothesis, which is that light color does affect or has an effect on plant growth. So this is again a quick recap about null and alternative hypothesis. And please note the symbols of these hypotheses. Null hypothesis is denoted by H naught and alternative hypothesis is denoted by HA or H1. Now the null hypothesis usually states what is generally believed, the commonly accepted fact or the status quo. Status quo means the existing situation. Like in the previous example we saw, if the research was to study whether plant growth is affected by light color, the null hypothesis will be that plant growth is not affected by light color. Now there are two things that can happen to the null hypothesis as we saw in the previous slide as well. If the research evidence shows that the null hypothesis is true, then we will fail to reject the null hypothesis. Means we are saying the null hypothesis is true. If the evidence shows that the null hypothesis is false, then we will reject the null hypothesis. Now, the alternative hypothesis, as we already saw, is the opposite of the null hypothesis and it represents a change from the existing situation or the status quo. If our research is to study the effect of light color on plant growth, then if the null hypothesis was that plant growth is not affected by light color, then the alternative hypothesis is that plant growth is affected by light color. Now, what is the possible outcome regarding the alternative hypothesis? The only outcome for the alternative hypothesis is that if the null hypothesis is rejected, then we will accept the alternative hypothesis. There are 2 points I would like you to remember with regard to the null hypothesis. In research, we test only the null hypothesis. This has been asked in many exams. Which is the hypothesis that is tested? We do not test both of these hypotheses. We test only the null hypothesis and we choose whether to reject or to retain it. So the null hypothesis is the one that is tested. And based on our evidence, we get a significance value. I'm sure you would have heard of the term p-value when doing your research. And based on the p-value, we decide whether it is statistically significant or not. And based on statistical significance, we decide whether to reject or retain the null hypothesis. So it is the null hypothesis that is tested. And why do we call it the null hypothesis? Usually, it is generally believed that the null hypothesis is called null because it usually has these words, no difference, no association. It usually has that word no, but that is not the case. The null hypothesis is called null because this is the hypothesis that is nullifiable. Nullifiable means proved wrong or proved to be nothing. Because when we do a research and the evidence proves that the null hypothesis is wrong, then the null hypothesis becomes nothing and we accept the alternative hypothesis. So in that situation, the null hypothesis is nullified or made to be nothing or proved to be false. And we accept the alternative hypothesis. And that is why it is called null hypothesis. Because it is the hypothesis that is nullifiable. I hope it is clear up till now what is the research hypothesis and The two types of hypotheses that are usually stated in research, the null and alternative hypothesis. Now we will move on to the last part of our session, that is errors in hypothesis testing. When we talk about hypothesis testing, remember we are talking about testing the null hypothesis. When we test the null hypothesis, when we do research, we collect data, we run statistical tests on the data, we get results from those statistical tests, and based on those results, we decide whether or not to reject or retain the null hypothesis. So remember, this decision on whether to reject or retain the null hypothesis is based on the data we collect. And in most cases, the data will not be perfect. There will be sampling errors, there will be data collection errors, there will be bias. So if the data is wrong, there is high chances that we make a mistake in deciding whether or not to reject or retain the null hypothesis. And those mistakes are what we technically call errors. And there are usually two types of errors we can make when testing the null hypothesis. The first is type 1 error and the second is type 2 error. We will see this a little more in detail. Before we get to the errors, we will first see what the usual situation is. In reality, if the null hypothesis is true and our data, the data which we collect from our research, tells us that the null hypothesis is true, then we fail to reject the null hypothesis or we retain the null hypothesis. In that case, we have made a correct decision. If in reality the null hypothesis is false and the data we collect from our research tells us that the null hypothesis is false and we have to reject it, we reject it. And in that case also, we have made a correct decision. In these two cases, we have made the correct decision, all is well. But if in reality the null hypothesis is true, but the data wrongly tells us that the null hypothesis is false and we accidentally or by mistake we reject the null hypothesis, then we have made an error, and this error is known as type 1 error. Now, if in reality the null hypothesis is false, but the data tells it is true and we accidentally fail to reject it, in that case we have made the second type of error, which is known as type 2 error. So if the null hypothesis was true but we accidentally rejected it thinking that it was false, we have made type 1 error. And if the null hypothesis was actually false but we accidentally failed to reject it thinking that it was true, we have made a type 2 error. Now, remember that in research, type 1 error is a much bigger crime than type 2 error. So, our efforts as a researcher will always be to reduce type 1 error. Why? Because in type 1 error, the null hypothesis is actually true, but we are accidentally rejecting it and telling that something is actually there. And that is a big problem. I'll tell you why. In clinical trials, they want to test the effect of a treatment on a particular medical condition. So they divide groups. They give the treatment to one group, and they give the control, or they give a fake treatment that does nothing to another group. And they test whether there is any significant difference between these two groups regarding that particular medical condition. The null hypothesis will be that there is no difference between these two groups. But if the data you collect from that study is wrong and the data is telling you to reject that null hypothesis, saying that there is a difference between those two groups, then the researcher might wrongly believe that the treatment actually worked and he might actually take it to another step and start marketing the treatment when actually there was no difference between the groups and it did not help. So it gives a wrong impression. So that is why, on the other hand, let's say there was actually a difference, but your data tells you that there was no difference. So you think, okay, the treatment didn't work, then nothing will happen. The researcher will think, okay, maybe it's a failed study, and he will ignore it. But if there was no difference and you market that treatment saying it actually helps a medical condition when in fact it didn't, that is a big problem. So type 1 error is a much bigger crime than type 2 error, and that is why researchers always try to reduce the type 1 error. Now, this slide basically says the same thing as you see on the top. The conclusion you get from your statistical analysis or from the analysis of the data which you have collected from the research, you either accept the null or you fail to reject the null hypothesis or you reject the null hypothesis. Those are the two conclusions you can make from an analysis. And on the right hand side, what you see is what is there in reality or the true state of nature. Either the null hypothesis was actually true or the null hypothesis was actually false. Now, in the first box, you see the null hypothesis was actually true and you have accepted the null hypothesis or you failed to reject it. In that case, you have made a correct conclusion. However, if the null hypothesis was actually true but you rejected it, you have made a type 1 error when you reject a true null hypothesis. Now, in reality, if the null hypothesis was false but you fail to reject it, you make a type 2 error when you accept a false null hypothesis. But if the null hypothesis was actually false and you reject it, in that case, you have made a correct conclusion. Now, we will look at a story to help us remember or to help us understand these two errors a little more easily. I'm sure you are all familiar with this story. We all would have heard it in our childhood. It is a story of the boy who cried wolf. So now I will first tell the story and then I will show you how it relates to errors in hypothesis testing. So there was a village. Once upon a time, there was a village, and the villagers kept a lot of sheep. And in that area, there were also wolves. And we know that wolves can eat sheep, attack and eat sheep. So the villagers hired a small shepherd boy to look after the sheep and protect it from the wolves. So the villager told this boy, if a wolf comes, you should loudly cry wolf, wolf, and then all of us will come running and drive the wolf away. So they hired the boy, and the boy was looking after the sheep. After many days of looking after the sheep, the boy started getting bored because he's doing nothing all day long. So he thought he would have some fun and play a trick on the villagers. So there wasn't any wolf, but he simply cried out, wolf, wolf, there's a wolf attacking the sheep. Now the villagers, hearing this cry, thought that there was a wolf attacking the sheep and they came running. When they came to the sheep, only they realized that the boy had played a trick on them. And they were very angry with the boy. They scolded him and told him not to do it again. Now, a few days later, again the boy started feeling a little naughty and bored. So again he thought, okay, I'll trick the villagers once more. He thought he'll have a little fun. So again he cried, wolf, wolf. Again, the villagers thought that there was a wolf attacking the sheep. They came running to drive the wolf away, but there was no wolf. And this time the villagers were very angry and they told the boy, now if you call wolf, wolf again, we will not come. The next day, what happened? A wolf actually came to attack the sheep. Now the boy cried, wolf, wolf, there's a wolf attacking the sheep. But the villagers thought the boy was playing a trick on them and they didn't come to rescue the sheep. And the sheep were all eaten by the wolf. So that is the story of the boy who cried wolf. Now we'll see how it relates to hypothesis testing. In this case, the null hypothesis or the accepted fact is that there is no wolf. And the alternative hypothesis is that there is a wolf. What happened in the first situation when the boy cried wolf, wolf? The villagers incorrectly rejected the null hypothesis that there was no wolf. They thought that there was a wolf, and so they made a type 1 error and they came running thinking that there was a wolf. A type 1 error is called a false positive because you think that something is there when actually nothing is there. So in that case, the villagers made a type 1 error. However, in the third situation, the boy cried wolf, wolf. There was actually, in that case, there was actually a wolf. So the null hypothesis was false. But the villagers thought it was true, thinking that the boy was tricking them, and the villagers incorrectly accepted the null hypothesis. In this case, the villagers made a type 2 error, which is also called a false negative, meaning they thought that nothing was there when actually something was there. This is again another trick to help remember type 1 and type 2 error. Type 1 error is you reject the null hypothesis when actually true. So you take the first letter of the words reject actually true and it spells rat. And the type 2 error is when you accept or fail to reject null hypothesis when actually false. So if you take the first letters of those words accept actually false, it spells AAF. So these are the two errors which researchers can make when testing the null hypothesis. And again, these errors happen because of small sample sizes, incorrect data collection tools, if you use tools that are not standardized or not properly calibrated, if there is a bias in collecting data, or if you incorrectly analyze the data and incorrectly interpret the data. So these errors can happen in testing the null hypothesis. So a quick summary. We started this class by saying what a research hypothesis is, which is a specific statement about a population that can be tested. Then we saw what a null and alternative hypothesis is. A null hypothesis is the commonly accepted fact or the status quo, and the alternative hypothesis is the opposite of the null hypothesis and it states a change from the accepted fact. And lastly, we saw the errors in hypothesis testing, type 1 and type 2 error, and we saw different ways on how to learn it. Now, these two errors have been asked several times in the in exams, particularly the UGC NET exams, so it is imperative that it is learned. And yes, that is all for this demo session. Are there any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, then thank you for participating in this demo session and we warmly welcome you to participate in the demo sessions that are going to happen on March 21st as well and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you once again.